And now I am directing you to, or asking you to hang on here for the next, or for the first, actually, the day one, the first panel. Are we on the cusp of closing the inequality gap in management leadership, exploring the role of management education? And this is a session with 4 high-level speakers from business, a dean and a former dean and a professor, and it is moderated by Abdullah Alim, lead the Davos Lab World Economic Forum. So please, welcome, over to you.
You are on mute, Abdullah.
No.
We still cannot hear you.
I believe there's a button on the bottom panel of the screen. So while we're waiting, maybe we can go ahead and just introduce ourselves. Thank you for your patience with work through this. I'm Jen Bratton, a managing director, senior partner at BCG. I've been with BCG for 19 years. Prior to that, I was a Sloan MBA student and an undergrad chemical engineering student at Vanderbilt. In addition to my client work, which is mostly in the operations space, I also run our Minneapolis office. And so I have been at the forefront of our people and talent agenda for the last 6 years, and also actively involved in recruiting new talent at BCG for over the last 15 years. Nice to be here.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. My name's James Roby. I lead the sustainability agenda for Capgemini. Capgemini is a global IT services and engineering services company with about 270,000 people across 50 countries. I've been leading on sustainability for around about 15 years, and it was really my MBA which motivated me to explore the area further, and motivated me actually to go on and do further research so that I could actively engage with business schools on the topic. And hopefully we can unpack a little bit more about that over the next discussion.
Hello, my name is Kang. I am president and dean at the Asian Institute of Management, which is located in Manila, Philippines. I'm currently vice chair-elect of the International Board of AACSB. I also sit on the boards of EFMD, PRME, and few other business schools around the world. It's lovely to join you on this panel with the audience. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Wonderful to see you. Yes, here I am, entering here because I'm so sad that Abdullah has some problems with his his technology. But you know how young people sometimes, find tech a little difficult. So I sort of step in here, and I'm so pleased to see you all again here. I've been talking with all of you. So I feel very comfortable in my new moderating role here today. So I would like to invite you, James, to talk a little bit. You had some really interesting reflections when we had a conversation last week about business education, about your own role as a practitioner for Capgemini, but also importantly as an educator, and sort of the gap that you may sometimes and in your own education have experienced. Could you talk a little bit about this?
Of course. So I'm just picking up the story where I got to. Having come out of an MBA, I was intrigued by the whole sustainability agenda and decided to go and do a little bit of more personal research, which ultimately ended up with me having conversations with my business about what are we doing, where are we going, and ultimately being asked to create a small team and build a sustainability agenda for Capgemini, first in the UK and then ultimately globally. But one of the things that really I was really reflecting on was my engagement with business schools. Was sustainability was this little 2-day elective at the end of a 2-year program, and I thought, well, this can't be right, because it's almost back to front. Because for me, sustainability and some of the other sort of social agenda items, they are the context of the next 20, 30 years that people going through MBAs now will be living and leading through in the future. So I sort of went on to a sort of bit of a personal quest, I suppose, to almost start challenging business schools to say, why can't we put sustainability at the front rather than at the back? And as part of that journey, I ended up doing a doctorate looking at the business case for sustainability as really a way of sort of accessing and engaging with business schools. And I think my contention is, if you teach the themes of sustainability, you teach climate change, you teach resource constraints, you teach the challenges we're going to have from a demographic perspective in the first section, in the first modules, then you can almost let the students drive the agenda. You can let the students then challenge the other lecturers. And I'm sure we'll come back to it, as I was talking to Matt earlier in the week, about this real challenge, because sustainability is such an interdisciplinary perhaps it's potentially the most interdisciplinary topic that we have to deal with.
Yeah, no, thank you, James, for these reflections, and also sort of your note of sustainability being at the end of that lecture or of that course or even of that textbook. And sometimes we don't get to that last section or that last lecture or that last chapter in the textbook, unfortunately. So you're very right. We're working on it. Jennifer, can I sort of also continue a little bit our discussion that we had a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this session? And you working as a manager in BCG, you meet a lot of companies, and also you have in your own sort of managerial role experiences with, you say, sort of the working with sustainability and new pressures, new quests. So could you say a little bit about this?
Yeah, it is definitely becoming a forefront topic for us internally. We actually just established a new practice area that is focused solely on sustainability and climate. We have seen through the COVID pandemic that the lens that is being placed by investors and the community at large on this is really causing companies to look in a different way internally at their operations, at what they're doing, in order to really understand the impact to our world and our globe and our planet, and really look in the mirror and challenge themselves. Where can I make a difference when consumers are walking the talk with their feet and where just and it's just been a really focal point for us as a company on where we're putting a lot of effort and energy going forward, to continue to push the thinking, look for new insights and innovation, and just reframe the challenge so that it becomes more surmountable for people.
Yes, no, thank you for this. I was curious to hear about this, and I'm happy to hear that there is this new push that you are really experiencing, also from your clients. So, Chi-Young, you're the president of Asian Institute of Management, and you are in sort of much contact with students, and of course all the whole educational system, higher education, also in your role as a board member of AACSB, and of course also a board member of Prime. So are we doing enough? We now hear to Capgemini, we hear BCG asking us for more, focus on sustainable development. Are we doing enough?
I have so much to say about this, but I would like to start my response by quoting Andrew Grove, the legendary CEO of Intel Corporation. About 2 decades ago, I'm sure many of you read the book, Only the Paranoid Survive. He created this term, strategic inflection point, to mean a time in life of business when its fundamentals change. I believe higher education is at that strategic inflection point, or has been for a while. Its landscape has been completely affected by all kinds of transformative market changes, which actually present threats and opportunities. And I think only those who will be able to strategize to rise and pivot will survive. However, I think there are widespread criticism that our business school teaching is not well connected to what is being practiced. For example, think about how the world has changed so much in recent years, but I'm not so sure if we can say the same about how we have changed MBA curriculum, just an example for the same period of time. I think there is some truth in the criticism why the business school are receiving this. Similarly, if you think about the research, I just come off an advisory board meeting for a top school, and we had a really interesting debate about whether we should encourage their faculty to do more theoretical publishable in top rated journals, or we actually need to encourage faculty to do more dissemination, to do research that are more impactful, generate knowledge that can be adopted by practitioners. I'm not sure if there's a really simple answer, but again, I think societal impact is such an important concept that we cannot really ignore how it means for our everyday operations in business school, whether it's teaching, whether it's research, whether it's outreach. And lastly, I think there are increasing concerns around purpose. If you think about our education, our training program, how many newly minted managers whom we train and graduate every year from our institutions, we can say they're aware of the gaps between purpose and, say, profits. Many of our business operations have left behind very, very wide gaps between what we do to this planet and people. And this is indeed a matter of great, great concern. So, for example, I think it's a very sad truth that many corporate business practices and operations are adding to carbon footprint. I heard very recently that one of the groups of researchers or academics creating the most carbon footprint happened to be people engaged in sustainable research. I don't know how much of that is true, but I don't think it's exaggeration if it says sustainability is one of the biggest challenges humankind faces today. Good news is that many business schools are increasingly realizing that sustainability creates value. It's not just a lip service. It's not just something that we have to think about along the line of 17 SDGs. But I think it actually can drive growth. It can address risk. It can attract capital. So focus on purpose and our education, our training that puts the purpose in the center of our mission is important. And fortunately, slowly but surely, more and more schools and curriculums and programs are going in that direction.
No, thank you very much for this push and for these suggestions, Chi-Kyung, for us to up the game even more than what we are doing already. I would love to hear you, James, back to you and sort of ask, what do you think we could do better? What some of the concrete solutions? Now, in her keynote, in her fabulous keynote, Tima Bansal was talking about that we are teaching societal solutions for organizational actors. And she was also giving us a call for action to put society at the center. How do you reflect on these? What do you think about these reflections from Tima?
So I think the starting point for me is teaching the background, teaching the reality, and actually getting into the detail of some of the key mega trends that are going on, which I suspect the vast majority of the people on the planet still are really unclear of. Whether it's things like the global population increase, and the fact that in terms of our global production systems, we're going to have to provide for probably another 2 billion people over the next 30 years. That's adding another 1.5 Indias to the global population. At the same time, we know that we need to manage the amount of carbon and pollution that we're putting out of the production system. We know that there's huge issues in certain parts of the world around water scarcity. And actually, I think the starting point for me, and they're probably there from the environmental perspective, equally, we could be talking about a whole range of social concerns and issues. And actually, I think a really good starting point is actually teaching some of the facts and figures behind that, and then enabling people to explore that and really to think about what does that mean then in terms of where they want to drive their career. I think from the teaching I've been doing over the last few years, one of the most rewarding things is when somebody comes up at the end of a program on sustainable business and says, do you know what, I've completely changed the direction I want to take my career now based on an understanding of actually the situation we find ourselves in globally. So I think that's the starting point. And I think just to pick up on some of the other points, I think my research with about 200 of the world's largest organizations found that there really is a very clear business case for sustainability, and that business case is at lots of levels. Certainly, I think anybody who is a large corporate these days understands that if you don't have the right track record, if you're not doing the right social and environmental programs, actually the best graduates won't want to work for you. It sort of starts as simple as that. And if you want to attract the people you need, you have to take sustainability seriously. But then it goes beyond that, because then increasingly clients have expectations. And as was mentioned before, the financial community has expectations. If you want to access capital, whether shareholder capital or investment capital from banks, people are asking more and more questions. So the business case is kind of absolutely clear in terms of sustainability. And I think that's the sort of space that business schools could really be investing in unpacking across the curriculum. Whether it's finance, whether it's economics, whether it's production, whether it's human resources. Sustainability needs to thread right through.
Yes, no, thank you very much for these reflections. And I was actually going to invite you, Jennifer, to talk about, the inequality gap that we had a little conversation about that also in our Zoom call a couple of weeks ago. But now I'm actually asked to leave you because Abdullahi is wanting to get in. So maybe I'll get out here and I will ask you, Jennifer, to talk a little bit about inequality. Abdullah, are you with us here? Can you unmute yourself, please? I want to see you unmute yourself before I leave. We cannot hear you. Yeah, okay. So let's continue the conversation with inequalities, because I would really like to hear your reflections, Jennifer, on the inequalities. You talked about the COVID, how the pandemic has sort of changed the way we engage, and a lot of for business, but indeed also for education. But we have also seen how the COVID pandemic has increased inequalities, social, racial, economic, and all sorts of other inequalities. And I would like to ask you for your experience with what is happening. What do you see with inequalities, and how does that reflect and inflect upon your business?
Yeah. So there's a couple of points I would make on this one. The first one is, I think, the one that we all immediately think of, right? As the pandemic caused us all to sort of sit still and rely so much on technology and on digital in order to communicate, to work, to do our business, it became very stark, the contrast between who has access, who has bandwidth, who has Wi-Fi, how stable is it, how large is it? And and I think about my children, right, that were all of a sudden in my basement doing school, and how easy in some ways it was for them to navigate that and figure it out, and how challenging it was for other students, other peers of theirs in school who might not have, adequate setup, access to the same technology that we do. And I think that's only the beginning, right, of how that exacerbates. I think a different lens that maybe isn't as natural that comes to mind, that we have, started to see not only internally within BCG, but also in our clients, is the fact that COVID has really created a transient job market in a new way. I think throughout last year, those of us that were lucky to have job security and were impacted by COVID, depending on the industries you were in, stayed, right? I mean, I think we all were looking for stability. There wasn't a ton of voluntary attrition last year, but we're seeing that shift. I think people had a couple of insights through COVID, right? There was the YOLO phenomena that continued to evolve, right? You only live once, and really questioning whether it was how much they were traveling, the work-life balance, you know, what is really their purpose? You know, back to a point that was made earlier, what is the purpose of the company that I'm investing all this time in, and really holding up a mirror to that, combined with the fact that we've all proven how effective we can work virtually, has really opened up this geographic constraint that may have existed before on where I could work without disrupting my family, moving them halfway across the world or the country or whatever it is, and really opening the door, right? The positive news is there's improved access to jobs, the job market in many ways. The downside is we're all competing for the same talent, right? And now that talent is much more transient in a new way. And if I think of it from a lens of a corporation that's looking to access that talent, you know, now we're competing in different ways, in new ways, specifically for diverse talent. And, you know, that's really a consideration that we've got to think about going forward.
Yes, no, thank you very much for these reflections, Jennifer. And as you say, we have certainly experienced that we can sort of travel the world from home, and hereby also liaise with colleagues that we had not anticipated to meet. I mean, this very conference is an evidence of this. We're meeting so many wonderful people that we would not have met if everything were bound to happen in New York.
And some of the challenges of technology that go with that.
Yes, also I can tell you that here in the chat, we are having Professor Sami Bonsu from GIMPA, Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration, wanting to get in, but there is some tech issue also. And he wants to bring in some critical reflections to the panel here. And he's sort of saying out here in the chat, consider that African business schools teach mainly European and American material that do not always fit the continent's context. It is like we are preparing students to migrate to these destinations. We need a rethinking of these dynamics that support inequalities at both the micro and the macro levels. And I really like the spirit of this, Sami Bonsu's comment here in the chat to us. And also I want to bring it into the panel here, that sort of as part of the inequality discussions, so the transport of, you could say, of thoughts and thinking from the north to the so-called global south. Then we've had a period, I think it's fair to say, where we're sort of trying to collaborate. And what I hear right now is a new voice from some of the deans from the south, for example, Sami Bonsu here, saying, hey, what about the global south? Perhaps, you know, teaching the global north a few of the things. For example, and these are my own words from other deans also, for example, about impact. And Chi-Young, could I hear you're based in the Philippines, and I would love to hear your reflections on this particular challenge from Sami.
Right. Again, I think what the pandemic did was to change a lot of our perspectives or positions or opinions. So yes, I mean, I completely agree with some of the points raised earlier that, you know, access is such an issue in developing countries, whether it's Southeast Asia, Africa, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you know, I was at one of the meetings, and half the deans sitting in the meeting room, you know, in a Zoom meeting, said, you know, I completely changed my point of view on work from home, almost 180 degrees. I used to be completely opposed. That's not going to happen in my school, you know, for all the right reasons. But during the pandemic, when we were forced into the situation, I realized actually, as long as we set the correct parameters, right policies, right environment, actually that can be a very productive way of tapping the talent that would normally be able to tap because of the distance of travel and so on and so forth. The same thing with the access, even at places like AIM. If you look at our tuition, I would say 95% of population in the Philippines say AIM's tuition is beyond something they can even dream of being able to pay for because it's so high. On the other hand, if I compare to top business schools around the world, it's not even 1/4's worth of tuition. So everything is relative. If you look at my colleagues, we are very participant-centered learning, case-based teaching. And most of my colleagues have maintained that we cannot really do many of, if not all of our courses taught effectively online. And they are very hesitant to get into online teaching, blended learning, hybrid classrooms, and so on and so forth. But we had to switch the entire 7 master's program, going from one day to the next in 2 weeks. We had no choice. Nobody had time to complain. They were not given options, and luckily nobody complained. Everybody just got on. Everybody did their best to be able to be now a good Zoom teacher in a Zoom environment, not just in the classroom. So what it did to our faculty is actually, let's think about this. We being in sort of like Manhattan of New York or London City, most people in the Philippines, in the region, cannot dream of coming to AIM. But now we know how to do this online. We know how to actually teach online and give access to people who wouldn't dream of accessing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, we can take a pessimistic view of all the things that are happening. But when we talk about, important, 6 values of PRME, or purpose that I talked about, sustainability that has become so important, I think there are plenty of opportunities for us to explore what we can do to take advantage of this different mindset. And I think that's the key thing that we're talking about, rather than glass half empty. I think we can look at opportunities and focus on that.
Yes,
it's really interesting. I think the experience of teaching and having gone online overnight was that actually some things are very hard, but actually it gives a whole series of opportunities. I think some of the sidebar conversations that were going on in Zoom were incredibly rich, and there were students were helping each other with points and questions, and so we got a level of interaction that you just wouldn't have been able to have with 90 people in the room at the same time. Equally, some things are really frustrating and some things are really difficult. So I think it swings and roundabouts, and I guess we all had to go through that learning journey together.
Yes, no, indeed. I just want to say one thing before I welcome you, Abdullah. Please unmute yourself also. Good. I also want to say what Sammy here in the chat is also bringing to the conversation is that may be so, but even he's sort of saying, consider that my school had to give students money to help them buy data time to access the internet during COVID. Class time had to be shortened to be reduced the financial burden on some students. So the loss here can be calculated in terms of money and knowledge, at least. So there is still a real challenge in some continents, in some parts of the world that we need to take into consideration still. But Abdullah, Alim, I'm so pleased that you finally managed to join us here, and I would love your reflections on the conversations. I know you've been following the conversations in the background. You are the lead of the Davos Lab World Economic Forum. And I heard you moderating another panel, and I heard you as a panelist, and I was thrilled that you would join us here today. So I'd love to hear some of your reflections on the inequality gap in management, leadership, education. I know this is also something that you have been discussing with other people. Please.
Yep. First and foremost, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Because initially I was just a shirt, but I also wanted to make sure that I had content to share. Yes. I want to just say that very quickly, 2021 is the year of the Crossroad. At least that's the way in which majority of the organizations that I work with are billing it as such. 2021 is the year of the Crossroad, following 2020, which was the year of the fracture. So we've got this very pivotal window and opportunity right now, quite a narrow opportunity for us to rebuild our world in a far more equitable form. However, just because we have this window, just because we have this opportunity, we shouldn't also assume that it is guaranteed. And I think a very, very important reflection for us to not lose sight on is the year even prior to 2020, which was 2019. And the reason why I draw a particular distinction to this year is because 2019 was the year in which the majority of people who lost a lot of their wealth, lost a lot of their livelihoods from the 2008 financial crisis. This was the year in which they were truly able to recuperate their losses from just that year alone. And I understand that in 2020, this was very much an economic downturn induced by a pandemic. But I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that we are also operating within an economy that is also deeply flawed. And that business schools actually have a ridiculously large mandate to potentially steward the next generation of business leaders with a mindset to really tackle some of these existential questions. I, for example, went to business school after the 2008 financial crisis. No understanding from my degree as to what caused that crisis, which sounds ridiculous to suggest, but almost thank you for that. Almost to suggest that in many ways, business schools teach economics, management, finance in very abstract terms, and really negate the power of the term power itself in shaping economic outcomes. You know, when I think of the fact that the majority of those communities who are only now beginning to realize how flawed the economic system is, just going through 2 economic downturns in the space of 10 years, we have to reckon with the fact that a lot of this comes down to the research that shows that in many parts of the world, business schools still teach students with shareholder primacy at the core of the curricula. We also have to reckon with the fact that externalities such as the costs borne by the climate, the costs of inequality borne by those that are most marginalized when we make financial decisions, are never really truly accounted for. And so what we're basically leading is a generation of young people who I largely work with, who go into the world of business with very abstract understandings of how their actions interconnect with the larger political economy. And I think the biggest service that we can do to the next generation, and I want to also make it very clear, this is in fact an ask from the next generation. I'm talking about the millions of young people who marched for the climate over the last year and a half. I'm talking about the millions of teenagers who also protested in support of racial equity. I'm talking about the millions of young people who are trying as best as they can in many different forms of and ways to tackle the conversation of economic inequity, to really have a more holistic discussion around economics, around finance, around management, and how our relationship as businesses impact the wider world. This is a need, this is a desire on the part of the generation, and I think business schools really need to take this seriously, and it goes well beyond just introducing a single course on social impact or a single course on social entrepreneurship. No, it really needs to go into the core of how we teach accounting principles, on how we teach economics and neoliberal economics, on the forms of finance that business schools typically champion as the norm in the global South, and which unfortunately, as Professor Samuel also seems to suggest, trickle their way down to the global South as well.
Yes, no, thank you very much for these reflections, Abdullah. I really appreciate this call for action to take the content and transform the content of not just how we teach, but also what we teach. Thank you for this. I'd like to invite the panel just for before we close the panel, just one quick reflection from each of you on what is your most, best or strongest recommendation to leadership education? Because I really want your advice here, because I'm leading the Prime here, and I'm having a lot of wonderful dialogues with my colleagues around the world, and I would invite this panel to bring in some suggestions to Prime on what should we what is the most important thing we should do to advance leadership education along the lines of the discussion here. James, can I start with you?
Of course, and I think for me,
just very brief.
Very brief. And I think what COVID has really done is just shown us how interconnected we are globally, and maybe the interconnection between the SDGs is another way of thinking about that. I think back to what I said before, just to reinforce, I think we need business schools to start at the beginning by teaching students the perilous situation that the global production and global economic system is in at the moment, and then almost rely on the creativity and the curiosity of the students to then interrogate the lectures across the whole range of subjects within the business school to challenge, what are the economists doing about this? What are the production theorists doing about this? What are the HR theorists doing? How are you rewriting finance? So that's what would be my recommendation.
Call for sustainable development into all disciplines. Thank you. Yeah. Jennifer, over to you. Very short, brief comment.
Yep. So I think a topic we haven't touched on directly here, and I'm not sure it's the most important, but data and analytics are becoming such a critical part of how we are navigating business, how we are getting access to information to drive businesses. And while I don't believe all managers have to understand how to program in all the different languages out there, I do think they need to understand how all of these tools and technologies are interfacing, what's going on in AI and all the other different elements. And it's really just part of the critical language and navigation out there in the business world that is evolving so fast. And it's really, really, I don't think, emphasized enough.
Thank you for this call for data and analytics. Certainly important. Chi-Kyung, please, over to you. Very brief comment.
Right. I had a pleasure of moderating ASSB Teams Dialogue with Henry Mintzberg just 2 days ago. And he taught me this new word that I am deeply moved. And he says, leadership invokes the image of an individual, great white knight riding on a great white horse to save us all. I think maybe what business school can think about is sense of community. And he calls it communityship. And obviously, for us to change from leadership to communityship, we do need some leaders. But I think, the energy we can feel in the place, the community that are naturally engaged, maybe that's what business schools can think about rather than, making everybody a leader because we don't need all the followers in the rest of the world. So maybe we can shift our thoughts on what actually leadership means, and do we want to teach all our students to be the leaders?
Yes, thank you very much for this leadership call. I really like that also. Thank you, Chi-Kyung. Abdullahi, over to you for a brief comment.
Yep. Very quickly, just say that you cannot solve a problem from the same consciousness that created it. That's the famous Einstein quote that also applies to business schools. We cannot still be teaching the same language around shareholder primacy or even just a disregard for that dominant form of economic thinking and the way in which that typically shapes economic outcomes. I think we need to come to a space where we're empowering students to be systems leaders, which means accounting for the entire system and not relegating very important conversations around climate change, sustainability, and the costs borne by bad decision to the schools of social science, but really bringing that into the discipline of business too. And just to back what Chi-Kyung also just mentioned before, also knowing when not to lead. So it's not always the responsibility of businesses to lead from the front. Sometimes it's better for other agents with greater credibility to lead. Yeah, I think that's also an important one.
Yes, very important. Thank you so much, Abdullahi, for this comment also from you. And the last reflection from Sammy here in the chat is that he's talking about what he's suggesting, recommending is that we can do a lot. And with digitalization should come collaborative learning across contexts and peoples to facilitate student appreciation of differences. Actually, one of the topics for this very panel, how do we appreciate the differences, the many differences, the many beautiful differences between us also. So on that note, I just want to say thank you so much, panel, for being such a wonderful panel and for accepting my moderating role. Abdullahi, I will invite you again some other time. And Chi-Kyung, Jennifer, James, Abdullahi, and Sammy with us here in the chat. Thank you so much for your great reflections. I thoroughly enjoyed moderating this panel. Thank you. I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.